Welcome everyone who's signed in to the webinar, and welcome to our final installation of the 2021 season of the MES discussion group online meetings. So today's topic is going to be presented by Reno Pressacco, who will present on the checkerboard effect in mineral resource reporting for underground mines. And truly, Reno doesn't really need introduction, amongst this group. But I'll just, quickly kind of read off his credentials. Reno is a principal geologist with RPA, which is, of course, now a part of SLR Consulting. He holds a master's degree in mineral exploration from McGill University and has over 30 years of experience. Beginning his career as an exploration geologist, he developed a keen interest in mineral deposits, mineral economics, and mineral resource estimation. This resulted in his playing an important role in demonstrating the economic potential of the Matachewan gold deposit located in northeastern Ontario in the mid-1990s. His career has since progressed through roles in production environments and has included executive roles with mid-tier and junior mining companies. Since 2003, he has been providing consulting services for mineral resource estimation in relation to a large number of both domestic and international mineral deposits. Reno is currently an active member of the CIM Mineral Resource and Mineral Reserve Committee with a focus on best practices, as well as the PDAC Technical Session Organizing Committee. And today's webinar, of course, is presented by the CIM MES Society, thanks to the generous support of the Schulich Executive Education Center. And Reno, without further ado, I'll pass over the mic.
All right, thank you, Jess Lou. Let's see, we'll share my screen. So hopefully that's up and running. There we are. So thank you to the CIM MES group for agreeing to host us today and invite us to come and speak on the checkerboard effect. And thank you also to York University for assisting us in putting on this presentation. Today I'm speaking on behalf of Bill Roscoe, my co-author for this presentation. Just a very quick agenda. We'll start off with a few introductory slides. Then we'll spend a bit of time on concepts and backgrounds on the checkerboard effect. We'll move to some possible or suggested solutions, and then we'll wrap up. A very quick slide to introduce myself and Bill, my co-author here for this presentation, and you'll see in a minute for our paper. We've both moved to an associate role with SLR Consulting. Myself, in the last few months, Bill's been as an associate for about a year and a half, perhaps as much as 2 years. And the main point of this slide here is to make it clear that all discussions and opinions presented in this presentation are those of Bill and myself. We don't represent SLR or CIM in any way. So to begin, the fundamental requirement of the CIM definition standards for mineral resources is that they must demonstrate reasonable prospect for eventual economic extraction, so RPEEE for short. And one of the key takeaways of this presentation is that the mineral resource practitioner must consider the selectivity of potential underground mining method in relation to the spatial configuration of blocks below cutoff grade to blocks above cutoff grade when they're preparing their mineral resource statements. And Bill and I have referred to this as the checkerboard effect. In the presentation, we'll go through several examples of methods and approaches that are in current use for solutions. We'd like to stress that these are not an exhaustive description of all the methods that are out there in use for addressing the checkerboard effect. Rather, they're just intended as to stimulate thought and promote creativity. Practitioners are encouraged to develop additional solutions And if anyone is out there that is using alternate solutions to what we're going to talk about, I'd be very interested in discussing their approaches and hearing their thinking. So we invite, I invite anyone to get in touch with me, and there's contact information at the end to discuss their approaches and their thinking. So in addition to this presentation, Bill and I have recently authored a paper that has been published in the CIM journal. It recently came out just this April, April 2021. There's the title there, The Checkerboard Effect and Mineral Resource Reporting of Underground Mineral Resources. It's in volume 12, issue 1 of the CIM journal. Copies are available to CIM members. There's the link there, cim.org, library CIM journal, and you'll click down, you'll find the paper. And in addition to this paper, there's additional guidance on RPEE requirement for mineral resources in Chapter 6 of the Mineral Resource, Mineral Reserve Best Practices Guidelines 2019 that are also available on the CIM website. So moving to concepts now, we'll start with some definitions. These are definitions that my colleagues and I sort of use on a daily basis as we're discussing mineral resources. The first is the concept of internal dilution. So let me just grab a pointer here. What we mean by internal dilution is those assays in a drill hole that are below cutoff grade, below a nominated cutoff grade, but lie inside a mineralized wireframe. This is not a new concept. This is an old concept. It's been around for a long time. And we just refer to these assays as internal dilution. For underground settings, we have other types of dilution that we refer to, mostly in context of reserves and engineering. Planned dilution is that part of a potential stope outline that is outside the mineralized wireframe, capturing a little bit of waste. And unplanned dilution is also referred to as overbreak. This is the part during mining that we get extra break in the rock that comes in. It's uncontrolled. So for mineral resources, we only concern ourselves with the internal dilutions. And in fact, we'll see that mineral resources have always historically included internal dilution. Planned and unplanned dilution were always, to my knowledge, were considered as a part of the mineral reserve estimation process. Come on, next slide. There we go. So the concept of internal dilution, again, is not new. There have always been mineral deposits where, you know, the mineralization is not always present as assays all above cutoff grade from wall to wall. There are many mineral deposits where you'll have a run of above cutoff grade assays, then you might have some below cutoff grade assays for whatever reason, and then above cutoff grade assays again, and then the footwall contact of the zone, and out we go. So these blocks here, this is a breccia block, I guess, very nicely painted up. We can see this is an internal dilution block, but you get a sense here when it comes to operations. Here's the potential wall of the wall of the drive coming out. There is no realistic means to exclude this internal dilution when they go to take the next round here. And this is all going to be part of the blasted rock that's going to get excavated, the muck pile, if you will, and will end up getting sent to the processing plant. So the concept here is we're beginning to talk about is mining selectivity. So in some cases, these internal dilution intervals are such small size that they cannot be excluded when it comes to mining operation. And despite the transition to use of computer-aided methods for preparing mineral resource estimates, this characteristic hasn't changed. This concept has not changed in the last 120 years. We've always had internal dilution. So moving to these drill holes here, what I'm trying to show is here's an example of a drill hole just by luck of the draw, comes in, it would hit some of the mineralized zone, then hit the internal dilution block, pick up the mineralized zone again, footwall, and then out. A second drill hole nearby, next hole on section. This hole here, by luck of the draw, just intersects the full width of the mineralization to the footwall and then out. So the point is we can get some sense of whether internal dilution is present just by looking at our drill holes. So here we have moving into the digital world here. Most of the time now we're working on computer screens, and we're looking at digital representations of drill hole assays, and we're preparing interpretations of the mineralized outlines. So here in wireframe A, we can see an example if we're preparing wireframe interpretation at a 0.5 gram a ton cutoff grade. This interval here has a weak assay here, but the average grade of the entire width is 2.32. So that's considered full width intersection, and it's part of the mineralized zone. Next interval drill hole up here is 8.35, no problem, wall to wall, there we go. But in wireframe here, we start to see some examples of internal dilution that are showing up in the drill holes. This drill hole here, they don't have numbers, doesn't matter. Here we have 1, 2, 3 assays that are below the nominated cutoff grade, but we have a couple of above cutoff grade assays on the footwall contact. The entire interval is averages 3.4 grams a ton. So that could be, we've always marked that off as the mineralized zone and include that into the mineralization wireframe. Next hole up, we can see instead of 3 assays, we have a lot more assays of internal dilution. But again, the average grade of the entire mineralized zone is above the cutoff grade. So there we go. We draw the hanging wall contact at that assay and the footwall contact at that assay, and just include the internal dilution as part of the mineralized wireframe. And third drill hole up here, we're back to 3 below cutoff grade assays, and there's the entire zone there, average grade 4.72. So we'll see in a minute. Historically, when we were working on polygons, we would just be working with these assays here, the average grades. But when it comes to block models now, some of these internal dilution zones will end up is in estimating grades into blocks in the block models that are here, such that we'll end up with blocks that are inside the mineralized wireframes that would have estimated grades below the nominated cutoff grade. And that's going to be a problem. We'll see in a minute for how the computer can deal with that. So just taking a step back to the way it used to be done back in the day. So this is a polygonal view on a long section here. So here the dots represent the center pierce point of a drill hole. The numbers are the average grades. So here you can see that these grades here, these are the average of the all of the intersection of the pierce point from hanging wall to footwall. So we can see that even back in the polygons days, we would have some drill holes that are outside. They'd hit some interesting mineralization above the cutoff grade, but either their neighbors just happen to intersect the structure, but it's not particularly mineralized, that have poor spatial continuity. So these would be isolated intersections with no apparent continuity, or the drill holes would intersect a weak spot in the structure where the average grade would be of the pierce point is below the nominated cutoff grade. And in some cases, these below cutoff grade pierce points would be so small of a size that in the judgment of the QPs would not be, could be selectively excluded during mining operations. So we always had very interesting conversations back in the Polygon days as to which of these polygons should be included in the tally and which should be excluded in the tally. And we'll come back to that in a minute. So deciding which polygons to include in the tallies and not was actually very easy to implement. So to exclude this block or exclude that block and include that block was very easy to implement in the Polygon days because the tallies were done by hand. So it was very simple to say, I don't want to include that block, leave it off the list. Or I need to include these two blocks, they have to go on the list. So in the Polygon days, it was very easy to make that decision. It was done by hand. In computer world, that turns out to be a lot more difficult, and we'll see that in a minute. And in computer world, we generally, or we see a lot where practitioners are simply applying the concept of reporting all blocks above a nominated cutoff grade for preparing the mineral resource statements. And Bill and I, we refer to this as just using a block cutoff. This approach we'll see can have unintended results. So just counting all the blocks above a nominated cutoff grade might not yield the result that we're looking for. So to begin to understand the concept of the checkerboard effect, let's begin with a checkerboard. So here, let's pretend that the boundary of the checkerboard is the reporting unit that we want to report within. The checkerboard is 8 by 8 blocks, 64 blocks in total. The red blocks here represent above cutoff grade mineralization, and there we have estimated grades in the block. The gray blocks are blocks that are below the nominated cutoff grade. And we'll see some variants coming up in a few minutes here. But for the purpose of this particular exercise and this particular slide, we're just going to consider the grade of the gray blocks as 0 grams per ton cutoff grade. So when we tally up all of the grades in the red blocks, we come up with a total of 71.4. So the question is, now what do we divide by? Really, what we intend here, I think we'll agree, is that we want to divide by all 64 blocks, all of the blocks. So the tally, the average grade then becomes 71.4 divided by 64 blocks, or 1.12 grams a ton. But what happens in computer world when we ask the computer, report all the blocks above the cutoff grade, in other words, report only the blocks that are in the red, with grades in the red blocks, the computer says, I understand that. So here we go. The tally is now 71.4, but I only have 32 blocks, 32 red blocks. So 71.4 divided by 32 is 2.23. So there's your average grade, 2.23. But you can get a sense here that the computer is not understanding the spatial continuity of the red blocks, nor the relation of the internal dilution blocks in relation to the above cutoff grade blocks. So here the computer will give you a number, but it's up to you to understand whether or not this number actually makes sense. So by applying a block cutoff grade, this could result in a reporting bias because we're only reporting above cutoff grade blocks without consideration of the spatial continuity of either the above cutoff grade blocks or the internal dilution blocks to go with it. So beginning to move more into a real world situation, instead of a checkerboard now, let's begin to think about block scenarios. So here we have a representation of a block model. So there we have some rectangles that we can consider as blocks. The red ones are colored as above cutoff grade, the black ones below cutoff grade. So again, we say to the computer, report to me all blocks above cutoff grade, and here the threshold is 3 grams a ton. So it turns out there are 17 red blocks, and the average grade is 5.56. So when you look at that from a potential excavation scenario, you say, well, that doesn't kind of make sense, because I'm going to have to take those blocks as well. I'm going to have to take that block. I might not be able to get that single block itself. So we're beginning to understand the concept that we may have to include some internal dilution, and we may have to exclude some isolated blocks that we consider might not be achievable in a mining operation. So on the right-hand side here, we've refined our query a little bit. So the heavy black dashed line represents a potential excavation in an underground setting. So now the query is to the computer is not report to me all blocks above cutoff grade. The query now becomes report to me all blocks that are inside the thick dashed black lines representing the potential excavation volume. So now we have 24 blocks rather than 17. So we've got 7 internal dilution. So no, it's more than that. And the average grade now is 3.53. So here we can see that in considering a potential excavation selectivity, we have to include some internal dilution blocks, and we've excluded some above cutoff grade blocks that may not have sufficient spatial continuity to be extracted. Here's a real world example now, looking at some blocks in a block model. Here I've colored it very simply. The blocks in gray are below the nominated cutoff grade, and the blocks in red are above the nominated cutoff grade. So you can begin to get a sense here what would happen if we only report the blocks that are red. So here we could end up with a patch of internal dilution blocks that would not get reported. And here we have some examples of isolated above cutoff grade blocks that would get reported. So we would end up with a potential incorrect tonnage and grade report as a result of not including diluting materials and assuming too much selectivity for isolated non-contiguous above cutoff grade blocks. So we need to be clear here that this degree of checkerboarding will vary from deposit to deposit. And it even, when we get into it, you'll see it also depends on the cutoff grade that is applied for reporting. So there we are. There's a real world example. So again, here's another example where the degree of checkerboarding can vary from deposit to deposit. Deposit B, this is the one we looked at in the slide previously. And for comparison, here's deposit A. So in using a simple block cutoff grade for deposit A, you can get a sense that yes, strictly sensu stricto and strictly speaking, we might not get the exact correct answer, but it's going to be close. Rather in deposit B, just using a block cutoff grade, we might get a more severe bias as a result of using it just a straight block cutoff grade for reporting. So here again, is an example where we're seeing how the checkerboard effect can vary as a function of the cutoff grade. So these two images are from the same deposit. The image on the left is colored at a cutoff grade of 0.68 grams a ton. The bits in the pink, don't worry so much about them. They're just unestimated blocks, lack of drill spacing, sufficient drill spacing to estimate all the blocks in the wireframe. So here you can see there's a small amount of internal dilution. Stick out your thumb here and try to estimate that. That's from the old exploration geologist trick. That's about 3 to 5%, I think. But over here on the right, you can see what happens to the amount of checkerboarding as we move to a cutoff grade of 2.6 grams a ton. So much more severe here. So just to make the point that the checkerboard effect can vary from deposit to deposit, can vary in different places in a deposit, and it's also a function of cutoff grades. So now to look at some examples, some cartoons of what kind of variations we encounter or can expect from a checkerboard effect. We're going to look at a series of examples here. These are simple cartoons. So here we have red blocks above cutoff grade. And for the following conversation, we're going to assume that the grade of the red blocks is all 4 grams a ton. The grade of all of the white blocks is assumed at 0 just for the sake of conversation. And here we have 100 blocks in total here. So here, if we ask the computer report to all blocks above cutoff grade of 2 grams a ton, let's say, the answer is going to be we get 100 blocks at 4 grams a ton. And that's the correct result. That's what we expect. But now let's begin to look at some variations. Here we have the same distribution, same spatial distribution of above cutoff grade blocks, but now we've introduced 4 internal dilution blocks. But now the grade of the internal dilution blocks is not 0. The grade of the internal dilution block, just for the sake of conversation, is now 1 gram a ton. So now if we say apply a simple block cutoff grade and say to the computer, report to me all blocks above 2 grams a ton, the report is 96 blocks at an average grade of 4 grams a ton. Whereas the correct answer should be 100 blocks at an average grade of 3.88 grams a ton. So in a case like this, where we have a small amount of internal dilution, it's not, although not strictly correct, some resource practitioners may consider that these results are acceptable enough to use a block cutoff grade with the minimal internal dilution blocks. So moving to a more extreme example here, now we have 50 blocks of internal dilution. And again, the grade of the internal dilution is now 1 gram a ton. So again, if we apply a block cutoff grade, say, computer, please report to me all blocks above 2 grams a ton, the answer comes back 50 blocks at an average grade of 4 grams a ton. And you can see here, that's not what we intend. That's not what we expect to get. The correct answer, or the answer that we want to get, is 100 blocks at an average grade of 2.5 grams a ton. So what happens often, or almost all the time, in the checkerboard effect is that we end up underreporting the blocks and over-reporting the grade. It's always a lose-lose situation compared to reality. Underreport the tons and overreport the grades. So in a case like this, where we have a high amount of internal dilution, applying a block cutoff grade might not be considered acceptable by the mineral resource practitioner when preparing their resource statement. And moving now to an extreme situation where we have effectively no continuity. We can argue about whether there's a bit of a clustering in here. We still have 100 blocks in this cartoon here. And again, we can see here, if we say to the computer, report all blocks above a cutoff grade of 2 grams a ton, again, we get our answer is 100 blocks at 4 grams a ton. where reality would be almost nothing here. We might have to be able to salvage something in here. There's a bit of a clustering. We'd have to include a lot of dilution to maybe make some kind of a volume that's above, with an average grade above the nominated cutoff grade. So this, so in this situation here, this applying a simple block cutoff grade, we can see is pretty much an unrealistic outcome due to the lack of spatial continuity of blocks above the cutoff grade. And just to help the thinking here, as a thought example, think of a block cave situation. So if this was to be a block cave situation where we have all our draw points down at the bottom here, what are we actually going to get out of the block cave? Are we going to get only the red blocks coming out of the draw points, or are we going to get all of this? So what would be the more correct way to report this volume when we have a non-selective mining method, or a mining method with a less selectivity that's bigger than the size of the blocks that we're considering here. All right. So here we have some example of numerics. Here we're back to our slides that we looked at earlier for cutoff grades. So cutoff grade 0.68, cutoff grade 2.6. So here we have an actual tons and grade report down below here. So on the left, if we include the gray blocks, the internal dilution blocks, we come up with 1,160,000 tons, average grade of 2.65, 98,600 ounces. And if we exclude the gray blocks, so in other words, report only the red blocks, we come up with 1,130,000 tons, average grade 2.71, 98,300 ounces. So on a percent difference here on tons, we can see that it's 3% on tons, 2% on grade, and the metal content is 0 to within rounding error. So here we can see that the small amount of internal dilution doesn't have a really material, depends on your pain threshold or limit of selectivity that you wish to apply for materiality here. On the right-hand side, though, we have very much a different situation. So again, if we include the gray blocks, now we have the same answer. We have 1,160,000 tons at 2.65, 98,600 ounces. But if we count only the red blocks, we now drop to 481,000 tons. Now look at the average grade, 4.03. It's jumped quite a bit. And the metal quite a bit down, 62,400 ounces. So 140% on tons, 35% on grade, and 60% on metal. Now this would be, we'll see in a minute, just reporting either of these is really not what is satisfactory. We have to come up with some way to say, report to me all of these patches, these big patches, but count the gray blocks, and don't count these isolated discontinuous above cutoff grade patches. So we'll see in a minute. So moving now to the language that presented in the best practices guidelines, section 6.12.2. The language says mineral resource statements for underground reporting scenarios must satisfy reasonable prospects for the RPEE requirement by demonstrating spatial continuity of mineralization with a potentially mineable shape. So in other words, here we're representing the blocks in the center. In cases where this potentially mineable volume contains smaller zones of mineralization with grades or values below the stated cutoff, sometimes referred to as must-take material, this material must be included in the mineral resource estimate. So here we're talking about the white blocks that are inside the reporting boundary. At a minimum, these constraints can be addressed by creation of constraining volumes, which is the black line here, and constraining volumes should be used in conjunction with other criteria for the preparation of resource estimates. The language goes on to say, in many cases where the mineral resource estimate is prepared by digital methods, isolated and discontinuous blocks may be present that have grades or values above the stated cutoff grade. So here we're talking about these isolated blocks that are out peripheral, that have no spatial continuity. For underground mining methods, these blocks should be excluded from the mineral resource statement if their spatial continuity or their size is insufficient to achieve a potentially mineable shape above the nominated cutoff grade or value. So basically what we want to tell the computer is report all the blocks inside of this boundary here, including the internal dilution blocks. Do not count these spatially non-contiguous isolated blocks that are outside the boundary, and that's what's desirable. So to address the notion that somehow this is a new consideration, a new requirement for a mineral resource statement, in fact, it's not. Here on the left, we have another example of a polygonal estimate where you can see we have some polygons that are above cutoff grade that touch, and we have some polygons with limited spatial continuity. In fact, it's not a new conversation. It's the same old conversation. It's the same old discussion. This discussion has been around 120 years. I'll bet you our colleagues a century ago were having this conversation back in the Kirkland Lake and Timmins days and those sorts of things. The only thing that's new in this conversation is that we're using computers to prepare mineral resource statements rather than the old manual tally of the polygons. So it's not a new conversation. It's a very old conversation. So moving to some solutions here. So in some cases, when we prepare mineral resource wireframes for estimation, we could prepare our wireframes to include only those pierce points, drill hole intersections that are above the cutoff grade. So pretty much a traditional approach. In early days of the wireframing, I used to take this approach, and my colleagues as well. It makes it difficult for stitching these things together and achieving valid wireframes. Just a little bit more of a challenge on the wireframing ends. So when we do take this approach, the reporting approach would then be report to me all blocks that are inside the mineralization wireframe, inclusive of the internal dilution blocks. So here you can see sometimes we might have some internal dilution blocks that are inside the mineralized wireframes, but because the mineralized wireframes are drawn to include only the drill holes that are above the cutoff grade, these internal dilution blocks are easy to address. You just report everything that's inside the mineralization wireframe. But as I said, this approach can be challenging if the wireframe shapes get really complicated, and it could take a lot of time to get valid wireframes for reporting. What's more done these days is we tend to draw wireframes that push through some lower grade intersections for a number of reasons. Part is to maintain continuity, part is to, you'll see in a minute coming up, to generate pierce points for understanding grade distributions. So here we can see on the left, we have a good intersection, some internal dilution. Here we might have a drill hole that's pierced the structure, has some grade in it, but just the average grade of the intersection is just not enough to be above the cutoff grade, but we'll draw the wireframe anyway because we can see that the structure is still there, and we do wish to include it as part of the estimation approach. So what happens in these pierce points, these pierce points are actually very valuable. They're very important to include. because when it comes to looking at grade trends on longitudinal sections, we do need to know where these below cutoff grade intersections are and what their patterns are. So for this long section, the heavy black line represents a cutoff grade 1 gram a ton contour. And here, this heavy black line here represents a possible cross section here. So you can see on this cross section, we have a little patch of below cutoff grade material. And then we have above cutoff grade material, some below cutoff grade material, some above, but it all forms part of a three-dimensional pattern in here, such that when we're looking at it on cross section, we're seeing both the weak sections and the good sections here. So by including the below cutoff grade material, we get the necessary information that we need to map out the grade distributions, both the above cutoff grade and the below cutoff grade. And these contours, again, contouring on long sections is not a new conversation. Contoured long sections have been around for a long time. So they're very useful for understanding, where to put your drilling for identifying exploration targets, but they're also highly beneficial for understanding grade distributions for when you're trying to plan and lay out your variography studies. So they could be provide a lot of insights when you're trying to decide on which variograms make sense when you're looking at a whole nest of variograms and you're not quite sure which ones make any kind of sense at all. So when it comes to then taking these below cutoff grade intersections and estimating the grades into the block models, what ends up happening is we end up with a lot of internal dilution and below cutoff grade areas, and that poses the big problem when it comes to reporting, because here you can see the challenge that would come if we just report all blocks that are above the cutoff grade, here again colored in red here. We have a lot of internal dilution to consider. We have a fair amount of spatially discontinuous blocks as well. So by taking that wireframe approach, that does generate a problem for reporting. So a second solution would be to draw boundaries, clipping polygons, if you will. So in this approach, we would stand off on long section again and draw boundaries here by hand, or you'll see in a minute, we can get computers to do this as well, machine learning, AI kind of stuff. And now then, these clipping polygons or these boundaries are now used as constraints for reporting, preparing mineral resource reports. So the report would be, computer, report to me all blocks that are inside the mineralization boundary, so the red line, but also report to me all blocks that are inside the black dashed lines here. And in that way, we're taking spatial continuity into account, and we're including proper amount of internal dilution, and we're rejecting some blocks with limited spatial continuity or don't have the geometries for potential extraction. So here's an example of a manually drawn clipping polygon here. This is from an estimate that I did many years ago here. Here we have some existing mine workings, a bunch of drill holes that have continued to define mineralization. So here we can see the mineralization wireframe, the domain model is outlined in green. For various reasons, the estimated blocks are only there in the colored zone. So we have some areas that are unestimated. And we have, here, that's a one-hole wonder, one pierce point that happens to hit some good grade with no backup. It's one pierce point. And here we have some internal dilution. Here we've got some drill holes that have hit the zone. The grades just happen to be below the cutoff grade. So in this case, I've drawn this heavy black line as the boundary. This I've done by hand on long section view. So now the report comes, everything that's inside the green line, that's also been estimated, but inside the black line. So report all the red ones, the green ones, and the blue ones as well. And that is the mineral resource statement in this case. So those were clipping polygons drawn by hand, but there are actually solutions coming out now where we can use machine learning to draw these clipping boundaries for us. I'm a SERPAC guy, so this is a function that's recently available in that package. So on the left here, you can see an example. The black line is what I drew by hand as a reporting boundary. And on the right here, this is the boundary drawn by the machine using cluster analysis. It's k-means cluster analysis. And you can see that it's close, but as with anything computers, are you going to get exactly what you're going to get as you draw it by hand? No. There are differences. So you can see here, the cluster analysis included these big-ish patches of internal dilution, whereas by hand, you know, a few little tricks, bag of tricks here, I've excluded them from the report. Here's another example. The cluster analysis just drew the little embayment there. You can see my embayment is bigger, and I'm choosing to exclude those blocks as well. And similarly here, the cluster analysis is including this patch of internal dilution where I've drawn a larger embayment as well. So what happens is the manual polygons, they're very good. Manually drawn clipping polygons are very good to give you a high degree of selectivity, and as the practitioner, you get what you want when you do that. The problem is, you know, when you have several tens or many hundreds of cases that you have to address. So drawing manual polygons for 10 or 15 or as much as 20, that's about as many as you want to do for any reporting exercise. In some cases, we have tens, hundreds, thousand wireframes to deal with. And in this case, we have the ability to use machine learning to automate the process. So you can see an example where the machine learning k-means cluster analysis can give a good result. And last solution here, a common solution is to use reporting volumes as reporting constraints. So there are several software programs out there that are drawing these panels. I'm not using the S word. I'm making a very conscious effort to call them panels and not S's. The point of these is that these are criteria to help reporting criteria to help the computer report all the blocks that are inside the panels that are inside the wireframe. And we can argue about the solution here. So the advantage of doing these panels is because it's done by software, they can deal with a large number of cases very quickly and very efficiently, subject to choosing the correct parameters and correctly operating the software. So the resource, again, just to wrap up, the resource statement would then be all tons and the average grade of all the wireframe blocks that are inside the black mineral resource reporting panels. So just to wrap up very quickly, computer-aided block modeling can result in irregular and patchy mixture of blocks above and below the cutoff grade, and we term this the checkerboard effect. The block size relative to the minimum excavation size of potential underground mining method must be considered to comply with the RPEEE requirement for mineral resources. use of simple block above cutoff grade reporting criteria can yield undesired results when preparing mineral resource statements. Depends on the specifics of the situation. While the severity of the checkerboard effect varies on a case-by-case basis, in some cases, additional reporting criteria are required so that the RPEEE requirement of the definition standards for mineral resources is satisfied. The use of constraining volumes are useful criteria for meeting this requirement. And Bill and I would like to thank our colleagues, Jason Cox and Luke Evans, and to our other colleagues at the SLR Consulting for their support and encouragement in preparing this paper and this presentation. And we also extend our thanks to both our internal and external peer reviewers who graciously provided their time and expertise to review our paper and provide insightful thoughts and comments and recommendations for improvement of the paper. And here, if there are any questions, further contact, here's our contact information. Myself, Bill, Luke Evans, and Sean Horan, all at SLR Consulting. So thank you very much for your attention and for listening to the presentation. And I will turn the floor back over to Jessie Liu.
Thank you very much, Reno. Yeah, let's just leave that slide up for a moment so people have a chance to jot down the contact information, because Reno did let me know that during a previous iteration of this presentation, people kind of needed time to digest this information and ask questions, follow-up questions in the later days and weeks to come. But if there are questions now, please feel free to type into the Q&A button there at the bottom of your screen, and we still have a few minutes left to answer them. I don't see any questions right now, Reno, but I guess just kind of a high-level question from myself. How often do you see practitioners or kind of mineral resource reports prepared using kind of the wrong method of just not taking into account the checkerboard effect?
Bill and I, we've been tracking this effect, gosh, back to the mid-90s. So it's been 25 years. And as we say, it depends. In some deposits, there's actually very little checkerboarding that takes place, either because of the grade distribution or the cutoff grade. In other deposits, it's quite severe. It takes place, it occurs often enough that we think it should be something that should be an item that should be reviewed for every deposit to understand the degree of severity, for that specific deposit in that specific case.
So I just got a message here that Bruce Downing raised a hand and would like to ask a question, but I'm not sure how I can turn Bruce's microphone on. Bruce, do you mind just typing your message into either the chat or the Q&A, and then Reno will be able to answer. In the meantime, Ernie has asked, what are the significant differences in what's included or excluded when calculating resources as opposed to reserves?
So again, this is not intended to be a statement or a move towards declaring mineral reserves. Rather, it's more intended to move closer to the way we used to report resources back in the Polygon days, where we made sure that we included the internal dilution in the drill holes when we calculated our average grade for the intersections. And when it came to do the tallies, we were able to include the internal dilution polygons in the tally and exclude the isolated non-contiguous pierce points when we did our manual tallies. That's the intent here.
So Ernie's follow-up question is, so this is all to do with resources then?
Correct.
So I had another question myself. Is so doing this whole exercise, I suppose there isn't you're not really taking into account kind of a mine plan yet, right? This is before you even get to the point of extraction.
Correct. This is not an intent to try to replicate or begin to outline or define a mine plan. Even back when we were before computers, when we were drawing all of this, we were doing all these processes in pencil on paper. It was always a fundamental criteria of whoever was doing the interpretation that they had to have some idea of potential mineability when we did the interpretation on paper. So that leads to a concept of conversion ratio. The paper days, we aimed to have a high degree of conversion rate of resources to reserves. And part of the way of doing that is understanding what the engineers are going to be looking for when they have to design their stopes and try to draw the interpretations in such way that they begin to consider the extraction criteria and requirements that the engineers are going to apply, such that we do get a high amount of conversion from resources to reserves.
Right. Okay, so we've got a couple more questions here from the audience. Tuo Yu had asked, first, great presentation, Reno, and 2 questions regarding the presentation. First, is there a function to evaluate the level of spatial continuity of cutoff blocks for machine learning? Secondly, what cutoff block size should we use in estimating mineral grade distribution?
So I'm sorry, can we have the first question again?
Yeah, sure. First is there a function to evaluate the level of spatial continuity of cutoff blocks for machine learning?
So this K-means, this is a newish point of the thought process for me. I've been noodling on this for the last 6 months or so. I think the answer here is yes. You actually have to apply some input parameters for the K-means function to work on. So by picking those input parameters, you do have some control on what the output is. So that would be an analysis of the spatial continuity there, but it's not like we're going to do any kind of histograms yet. And this is all creative stage right now. It's all development stage. So we still have a number of questions to answer and a number of solutions to come up with. And I'm sorry, the second question?
Yeah, the second question was what cutoff block size should we use in estimating the mineral grade distribution?
So I'll say that this goes to the concept of conceptual operational scenario. And as mineral resource practitioners, whether explicitly or not, when we sit down and to prepare a mineral resource estimate, by the time we look at our first of the drill hole grades, in our minds, whether it's explicit or not, we're already beginning to think about operational scenario. So we have some notion of what the potential mining methods might be just by looking at the grade distribution in the drill holes. But also what we should also do is begin to the conversation with our mining engineer colleagues, saying, what candidate methods would there be out there for a conceptual operational scenario to help us draw our mineralization interpretations and get some idea of what sort of limits and boundaries there are on widths and spatial continuity, but also for cutoff grades, because the mining method has a very big impact into, they're all different and have different costs, so they'll all have different cutoff grades. The cutoff grade for blast hole open stoping would be a lot different from a cutoff grade for narrow vein shrinkage stope. So we have to have some idea a conceptual operational scenario in our mind. That's where the potential panel size would come into play.
Well, good to hear that the geologists and engineers do talk, despite what the rumors might say.
So one of the many main key themes in the resource reserve best practices guidelines is collaboration between all colleagues.
Makes sense. And Bruce's question came through. Why do we not report resource in volume rather than tons? This really depends upon estimating the density. A porous deposit can lead to poor density estimates. Actual mining is in volume of material moved.
In some cases, I have seen statements done on BCM, bank cubic meters basis. It's not to say that it's prohibited. I have seen them. It just, I guess we can say that the majority of the statements are based on tons and grade.
Okay, well, that concludes all of the questions, and I think that's our time as well. So hopefully everyone, oh, there's another one just popped up. Oh, just thanking you for the presentation. So anyway, yeah, hopefully everyone had a chance to take down the contact details of the SLR experts. And thank you again, Reno, for closing us out on a very successful, season that we had to quickly pivot. And yeah, please be on the lookout for announcements for presentations coming up in September. We're likely going to be starting with our traditional kind of season opener in terms of economic outlook given by the EDC. So thank you very much and have a safe and enjoyable summer, everyone. Bye.